I've been on this kick about learning Klingon, and to be honest, it took a lot of self-discipline for me to not write this entire Patreon thank you section in Klingon. You're welcome. So, Latanya, Steve, Lizzie, Dr. David, Michael, Jackie, Jean, Cuck, and Becky, thanks for joining the family and supporting the work we do on the show. We've got big things in store for 2018, and we're stoked to have you along for the ride. If you want to support the show, you can head to patreon.com/theatheist-manifesto and make a per-episode donation to support the show. I'm going to be doing some pretty amazing stuff over the next few months to advance this cause, and I could not be doing it without your support. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Love you lots. Your source for news, commentary, discussion, and debate at the intersection of the atheist movement and the LGBT rights movement. This is the Atheist Manifesto. Hello, friends, and welcome to the Atheist Manifesto. I am your host, Callie Wright, joined one more time by my fabulous, wonderful, and amazing co-host, Ari Stillman. What's up, Ari?
Hi, I'm pretty good, but I feel a little bit sorry for our guest today, who's going to get a little bit of a grilling. Hopefully not too much of a grilling, because we like to be nice and sweet people here on this show, but... Remember that time when you tried to set up a debate and it turned out that the two people who were debating didn't actually really disagree with each other at all? It was just kind of a semantics thing. Maybe this will not be that. I don't know. We'll find out.
I think this will be that. So, yeah. So,
I'm making him scared.
Quick, the tension.
Hang up while you can.
The tension is
We're
palpable.
very mean and evil people.
I'm having technical difficulties on this end. You're not coming through. I'm sorry. I'm kidding.
Oh, you can't hear us?
I'm kidding.
Oh, that was good. I like you. I like you.
We just got trolled by our guest. This is not okay.
Do what I can.
This is a fantastic start. So this is kind of a full circle episode for us here. You might know that a lot of my activist story has a lot to do with feeling like there wasn't enough space in the LGBT community broadly for non-believers. And when I started to get involved in the atheist movement, I thought to myself, man, like I finally found my people, right? Like even if I'm only one of a handful of trans folks who are active in the movement, like the cis folks around are on board, right? Like they're still my people. And of course, many of them were and still are. And I've built some of the most meaningful relationships in my life from the atheist activist community. But as has been discussed ad nauseum on the show, we are not a community without problems. And I don't know that...
we're perfect. We're great.
Right?
We're perfect and we're great.
And I don't know that our community's problems are unique, but they are pretty bad sometimes. I mean, dishonest con organizers, toxic comment sections, nearly the entire YouTube atheist community. It's kind of a shit show, right? Sometimes. And to be honest, atheism has kind of stopped being a primary point of organizing my life. Like, I'm happy to be part of the community. I still very much own my atheism as part of who I am. But if we're talking about like organizing for activism and social justice, to say the least, I think atheism on its own is not sufficient in its own merits. And that got me thinking about all of the amazing progressive religious folks I know. People who share my values in all the important ways. People who proudly say Black Lives Matter. People who will go to the bathroom with me to protect me, people who go to the ballot box to protect me, people who go to bat with their bigoted family members to protect me. And I can't help but think to myself, like, why do I care that they believe in a God I don't? If we agree on not just a certain percentage of things on a checklist of value, but like we share all of our important values when it comes to how we treat individuals and the kind of society we want to see built around us, why do I care? But like, there are reasons to care, right? We as queer and trans folks have a history with the mainstream church. The people who think we don't exist, the people who seek to exclude us, or even people who want us dead. Like, they're always leading with their Bibles when they say this stuff. And at least in the United States, of course. And frankly, I've got baggage. I look at history. I look at the current political climate. I look at the two important family relationships I've lost because of what they believe the Bible says. And there's a part of me that can't help but be resentful of anyone who uses the word Christian to describe themselves. And it's not enmity, it's not dislike or hatred or anything like that, but at the least I would call it a sense of distrust. Do you love me, but like in the way you're supposed to love broken people into fixing them? Are you nice to my face because you feel like that's what Jesus said, but you're going to fuck me at the ballot box? Do you sit in silence when your family talks about what a menace to society I am? Do you believe your obligation to treat people well ends with just simply being nice to their faces? And I have two competing stories in my head when it comes to my interactions with religious folks. I have the story of losing my relationship with my aunt and my grandma, where despite their love for me, despite their helping raise me in the context of an absent father, their beliefs in God wouldn't let them see me as the person I truly am. And now neither of them are part of my life. And the pain of that experience is really, really tough for me to see through. But the other story I have is the story of the Christian music venue I used to run sound at. When I came out, they went out of their way to treat me like family. With that group of people, I never felt like I was being loved because of or despite who I was. They just saw a member of their family going through a potentially painful and difficult process and wanted to make sure I knew they were there for me. And the guy that runs the place was one of the first people I sat down with to come out to. Like, my life was turning upside down and inside out, and they were among the first few people in my life who were there to see me through it. And of course, both of these experiences are real and valid, but it's hard for me to let go of the hurt from not only what I've experienced personally, but what's been done to our community as a whole. But the issues we're fighting are so much bigger than my own personal hangups, right? This is bigger than all of us. So I think we at least need to try to work it out. But how do we do that? I put that question to our guest for this week, and he bravely answered the call. So, John Pavlovitz, welcome to the Atheist Manifesto.
Thank you so much. It is really great to be with you, despite our jokes earlier. I'm really pleased to be here for sure.
Well, and John is an author, a blogger, pastor, public speaker, and here's the thing: I know John's a good guy, and you want to know how I know he's a good guy? Because I browsed the comment section of his blog, and it didn't make me want to crawl into a hole and die.
And I watched a 30-minute sermon on YouTube, and it didn't make me want to crawl in a hole and die. So
look at us.
That's pretty much the highest praise you're going to get from us.
Oh, that's an honor.
So what I'd like to do first, before we get too deep into the weeds here, why don't you just start by telling us a little bit about you and the work that you do?
Yeah, absolutely. I guess the short version of it is, I didn't grow up wanting to be a pastor at all. I was a visual artist, graphic designer, illustrator, and went to college in Philadelphia for illustration. But before that, I had been, fairly sheltered, suburban kid. And I always say that I had this story that I was told about God. And I had a family story, a family who loved me and was there for me. And I had this story of a God who supposedly made everything but knew me intimately and loved me completely. And so I had those two stories, right? But I had what I call the small table, because I didn't have a lot of people who were really different than me. Most of the people sort of looked and thought and believed the way that I did. And it was a real parochial environment that I was in. When I got to Philadelphia, my world just kind of expanded, and there I was in a really, surrounded by artists and musicians and actors. And I was living in the middle of Center City, Philadelphia, and I saw poverty and I saw injustice, and so many things just kind of opened up for me. And then 10 years later, I come to find myself working in a church, and I really went down this road of being a minister without even realizing it. Just little by little, I was volunteering with a youth program, and then a little bit more and more, until I finally got to the point where I left my career and started working full time in the church. And it was then that I thought I could be that person that I was in Philadelphia. I could have this expansive community. I could be surrounded by diversity. But I started to realize that the church actually was shrinking that table, was making me, more and more insulated. And that started to bother me. And I started to see what the church was doing, the theology of the church, especially in the Bible Belt where I ended up in North Carolina. And as that started to happen, I started to kind of inside not feel right about it, started to ask some questions. And I came to this point where I had to either kind of lean into those questions and lean into the stories that I started to hear, or I had to be kind of silent to keep my job. And I chose the former. I chose to kind of ask the questions and to push back a little bit. And so that's a little bit of my story. I ended up, 4 years ago getting fired because of that. And then that just kind of set me on a whole path where I could just speak as authentically as I wanted. And so it's been about 20 years that I've been in local kind of church ministry.
Gotcha. So I want to start with a couple of questions about your theology. And
Sure.
it's important to me that this doesn't become a debate on like what the Bible actually says or means. But I do think it's important that we understand where you're coming from, because like, I think you probably know as well as we do that the word Christian can mean a million different things depending on who you're talking to. So these questions aren't designed to necessarily be like challenges or debate premises or anything like that. But we just kind of want to get a baseline understanding of where your faith comes from. Is that fair?
Right. Oh yeah, for sure.
Sweet. Ari, take it away.
I wrote these questions. I did work. So, as I said earlier, I watched a sermon of yours. It looks like it took place right after the Pulse shooting in Orlando, where a gunman went into a gay club and murdered 49 people. And you were trying to give a bit of a hopeful and an inspiring message to people, it seems, from what I saw. That God has a plan for us. And it got me thinking, usually when you think of mainstream Christianity, people believe that God is all powerful, all knowing, and also benevolent towards humans. And I'm wondering, again, we don't want to get into a huge theological debate, but just so that we can get an idea of where you stand, do you believe that God has all three of those, I don't know what you would call them, characteristics? And if so, how do you reconcile that with human suffering that occurs on a daily basis, especially within marginalized communities like the LGBTQ community?
Yeah. I think first I kind of go back in my story a little bit. For me, growing up in that sort of sheltered environment, I was never a really conservative Christian and never a fundamentalist by any means. I grew up in sort of the Catholic faith, but it was more of a general idea about a creator. But what started to happen with me is I started getting more involved in ministry. I started to learn what I was supposed to say as a youth pastor and what the sort of party line was and and so I started to learn to say what I was expected to say. And what started to happen with me is that I started to I said that the life I was living, the people that I was meeting started to argue with my theology. And so I guess to answer the question, for me, the character of God growing up was always there was the heart of the character of God was this love, right? But then I started to see that it was a lot more complicated than that, because as I lived around people who were marginalized, and as I started to minister to teenagers who were struggling with all sorts of stuff, I started to try to figure out, like, what is the character of God? Is the God fully good? And there was a tension in me, and that tension's been there, and you see it in the writing a lot. I have days where I feel confident that there is a force that is goodness, because I feel it in me and I see it in other people. But I can as easily see people's capacity to do damage to one another. And so a lot of people will dismiss that and say, well, that's their fallen nature. And I don't really, at this point in my life, theologically speaking, I don't have a real strong kind of answer one way or another, other than to say that my faith leans a lot on the words and the teaching and the life of Jesus. And so when I'm centered around those things, I feel that sort of benevolence, I feel that compassion, and I feel that sort of selflessness, all those things that I grew up believing were the character of God. I find those in the teachings of Jesus, but I don't necessarily find them in organized Christianity. I don't necessarily find them in the whole of Scripture. So I have this sort of this faith that is centered around the life of Christ. And when I feel like I'm closest there, that to me makes the most sense, and it feels like a real life affirming way to live. But as far as, I don't believe that the Bible has anything to say specifically on gender identity or sexual orientation, because I simply don't think that the writers of the Bible had understanding of those things. And so I never used the Bible. I've never used the Bible as a tool to speak to someone about their identity or orientation. I think it's an improper use of the Scriptures. So there's a lot of stuff there, but I just kind of unpack as much as I can.
Yeah, that was something that I was actually going to also ask you about, is your view on the Bible and the inerrancy of the Bible. So, for example, you'll see a lot of people who are anti-social justice, who are homophobic or misogynistic or whatever else, use the Bible in order to support their views and say, see, it's in the Bible. You know, God says that homosexuality is an abomination. God says that that women should be subordinate to men. God says that we should do violence against people who break these certain laws, or against people who don't believe the same way we do. As a progressive Christian, obviously I don't think you believe that. But so I'm curious, what is your belief on what the purpose of the Bible is, the inerrancy of the Bible, and how do you talk to Christians who believe differently from you and think that the Bible gives them justification for bigotry and hatred?
Yeah. I try to, I can go one of two ways when I'm speaking to a conservative Christian, especially. I can either argue with them, okay, here's why I don't believe that the scriptures say what you're saying that they say. So you can take them verse by verse. But I before that, I try to speak to them on the level of just understanding what the Bible is and isn't to each of us. And for me, right, the Bible is, it's a journal entry, from that place and time in history of a group of people who had a faith, had a belief and had an understanding of the world and understanding of science, and they were recording those things. And so I look at those as a way to engage my own journey, but I definitely don't look at the scriptures as something that was dictated by God and that people just wrote this and it flowed from God through them. I see the humanness in the document. And so I try to speak to Christians and say, listen, whatever you're going to do with this thing, you have to realize it's not a book. It's a group of 66 separate books, and they're written over thousands of years in different languages and different authors. And so we have to approach it like a library, and we have to say some of this stuff is poetry, and some of it is, a biography, and some of it is song. And so that we look at those things differently, we treat them differently. So when I'm talking to a Christian who doesn't agree with me theologically, I try to have them understand this is how I see this group of writings. I don't see it as something that just dropped from the sky and that was it. I believe that it was a group of people trying to understand what life was about, and they recorded it, and I can glean a lot of things from that. So that's what I do with scriptures. There were obviously times in my life when I would have said that I didn't feel that way. I might have accepted that this was the word of God directly, but now I see that that's probably an impossibility. So I just I try to get as much as I can out of those writings. The way, you were talking about in the intro, that there's the atheist community and there's the tension that you have, and there's sort of this really disparate group of people in that community. And you're right, it's the same thing with Christianity. I mean, there is so much about organized Christianity and about Christians in general that grieve me. And so that's a lot of what happened to me. Here I am in the middle. I'm working for this kind of mega church in the South, and I'm, speaking to thousands of people, and I start to have this incredible tension because I'm seeing the damage that it's doing more and more, especially now in the political environment. But back then it was trying to figure out, well, how can I still be a person of faith and not be attached to this thing? And how can I separate myself from that really, really toxic thing?
I think that you actually are talking to God, because that was also one of the questions I was going to ask you. So you may not be familiar, but in the atheist community right now, there's a bit of a schism between the pro-social justice progressive wing and the more politically conservative, keep your social justice and your politics out of my atheism kind of wing of atheism. And of course, we're on the pro-social justice side. And there's kind of a saying, I guess, that's been propagated for a little while that if we have a choice between allying ourselves with progressive Christians or with conservative atheists, we typically prefer progressive Christians. Because although we don't share in their theology, we share values and we share our political beliefs, and we want to work towards the same goals here on this earth. So it sounds like you feel a lot of the same way about progressive atheists versus conservative Christians. What do you see as the role of progressive non-Christians, whether they're atheists or another religion, in social justice causes. And if it were to come down to a choice, would it be more important to you to promote social justice issues or to promote Christianity?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think for me, if I look at going back to the life of Jesus, I mean, that was what he was doing. He was with the marginalized, and he was pushing back against the systems that were in place. And I don't understand how people, if they're Christian, how they can claim to follow Jesus and not be about social justice. There just seems a complete, disconnect for me. And I'd say, more and more in the writing, I reach a pretty diverse group of people, and they're all sort of saying the same thing. They're saying, I want to figure out the best way to live on this planet. So whether or not I believe there's something beyond it, I want to figure out the best way to be a human being. And so for me, I love the idea, the bigger table that I talk about in the book. The idea is that I'm not really concerned with what your theology is. I want to know, especially if you're a Christian, I want to know what you practically are doing right now to improve the lives of other people. And it's just a simple idea of compassion. It's just, I don't understand how you can argue against people groups, or how you can have apathy toward injustice and claim a faith. Or really, if you don't claim a faith, well, why? I can't imagine how you could not. You mentioned somebody saying, keep your social justice out of my politics. And I don't understand a life that is absent of empathy for other people. And I think that's what a lot of people, whether they're religious or not, are responding to right now. They're saying, yeah, I'm done with this cruelty. I mean, I don't understand it.
Yeah, it's pretty much the same thing we're going through here on the atheist side. Like I mentioned, we're, over here on the social justice end of the atheist, humanist, secular, whatever you want to call it, movement. Mm-hmm. We're like, what is wrong with you people? Like, why? How can you believe in, for example, humanism? You claim to be a humanist, and yet you don't care about the rights of marginalized groups, or you claim to care, but then once you have to actually do something about it, then it's a little bit of a different story. Then it's like, I don't know about that. So yeah, go ahead. Were you going to say something?
No, I was just thinking, that I think it comes down to whether someone claims faith or not. I think there is a selfishness, a self-preservation that is really strong, and it's really difficult to jettison that. And I think you see that probably in the atheist community. I see it in the Christian community. There's a sense of I want to get for me and mine, whoever I determine mine to be. And that tribalism runs really strong whether you're in a faith community or not. And I think that's the hard part right now. It's getting through to the people who don't care about people who they don't believe are similar to themselves. Mm-hmm. And I, in the work that I do, I'm always trying to frame a conversation or a discussion in, can you teach someone to be compassionate? And if you can't, how do you reach people who just aren't empathetic? And I think so that's what's really cool in a way, because the conversation is not theology versus non-theology or religious people versus irreligious people. It's people who give a damn about other people or people who don't.
Yes.
And that's what I want to be. People, there are, conservative Christians who obviously despise me and say I'm going to hell and all this stuff. And I would rather be with a group of people who really care about the people around them, about the world that they're living in, the environment that they're living in. And, theology is going to be second, because honestly, the theology you see the conservative Christians brandishing, I have no desire to share that. So my affinity is for people's lives, to care for them.
I'm curious about this intersection between your faith and your politics, in the sense that from this conversation so far and from the talk that I watched on YouTube, it seems that your politics are very strongly influenced by your faith, in the sense that, you believe that Jesus would want us to be more inclusive and to bring more people to the table, as you put it. And yet there are others who use Jesus to justify the exact opposite view of that. So I'm curious
Yeah.
if for some reason you were to stop believing in God or Jesus or stop being a Christian, maybe not necessarily an atheist, but maybe some other version, some other religion or some other version of spirituality. Do you think your views on social justice would change if your theology changed, or would you still have the same views, but you would speak about them differently or justify them differently?
Yeah, it's hard to say, but I'm hopeful that would be the sort of an inherent thing in me because when I was in Philadelphia during that time when I first got to school, and I ended up working at a catering company, and they ran a cafe and a catering company in the university, and it was these two guys, Danny and Joe, and I write about them in the book, and I loved Danny and Joe, and I got the job there and loved the job, and about 2 months into it, I was like, well, Danny and Joe are great. They seem to be like really good friends and they own a business together and they even have a house together. And, I was totally oblivious. But of course, they turned out to be a couple. And most of the people in the catering company were gay. And for me, I tell the story that if 2 months earlier, if I had known that at the time, it might have intimidated me out of taking the job. But 2 months in now, I knew this group of people, and I loved them, and we were family. And so from that moment on, my ideas about what I wanted to do in this life were very different. And this was before I ever became a pastor, and ever really at the time I was what I'd call hopeful agnostic. But that time in Philadelphia and being around poor people and just expanding the group of people I was surrounded by, that was far before I ever became a pastor. In fact, being a pastor, like I said, I started to realize, boy, I'm not as good of a person as I was before. Being a pastor has made me less open, and that was bothering me. And so I probably hoped that I would, if I somehow abandoned my spiritual beliefs, I'd hope that, caring for people would still be the business I'd be in. Jesus and Christianity, that happened to be my road, but it could have easily been another road that I came through.
So I mentioned in my opening, one of the things that I struggle with a lot when we're talking about the progressive Christianity and that whole community is that the idea that sometimes it feels like there's an ulterior motive, like you're nice to me and you love me, but like at the end of the day, it's only because you want me to become Christian, get saved, repent my sins, figure out how broken I actually am and change my ways. And that's always kind of in the back of my head when I'm talking to someone that I don't already know super well. And to be honest, it kind of makes it hard for me to trust people. Can you speak to that at all? I mean, it basically boils down to like the love the sinner, hate the sin mentality, if that makes sense.
Yeah, one of the things I talk about in the book as a non-negotiable of gathering at the table with someone is agenda-free community. Because for me, I started to see that in the church, that there was always an ulterior motive in relationship. And that usually was, I want to get someone to accept Jesus, or I want to change an area of who they are. And that always felt like, selling someone a used car. It was like, I don't want to meet someone with some sort of hidden motive. And so for me, I could understand that tension, and I can understand that apprehension for sure, because it's a huge part of how so many evangelicals especially are taught that this is how faith is. Faith is you get someone to pray the prayer and you want to get them out of hell. And it's kind of interesting because if you look at it like that, like if I believe that there's a hell and I want someone not to go there, sure, I'm going to want to have them say this prayer and do all this stuff. But the difference is when your faith causes you to look at someone as morally inferior or needing to do these things before they'll be acceptable, that's a huge problem for me. And so, I meet so many people doing this work who are just have been completely burned by Christians. And yet, there are so many people of faith who are not that person, who do not have that agenda, who just receive people. So I talk about in the book about, what it's like to just sit with someone and hear their story and let that story speak to you and not feel compelled to change or fix or convert them. Because once you can do that with someone, once you have no plan on how you're going to steer them, you can just, enjoy life with them. How crazy an idea is that? Um,
Right.
and so that's the other part about it. When I stopped looking, I did that with students because I would have students come in every week, and new students to me, in the back of my mind, I wouldn't have verbalized it, but they represented, ooh, these are kids that I can save. And once I flipped the switch and said, these are just kids that I can love and receive, that changed everything for me as a pastor and a minister. And it changed our ministry because I started to get all these kids started to come out to me. And so much so that our pastor sat me down and he's like, tell me a little bit about, you've got a lot of these LGBT kids in your youth group. And I said, well, we really don't have any more per capita than anywhere else. It's just they don't feel
Maybe you're
terrified to
attracting
say
them.
it. And he
Right.
said, yeah, like I'm doing some subliminal artwork or something that's going to get them. And so I said, I want you to realize that they're the same number, percentage, but they just don't feel terrified to be who they really are. And I don't know why that is because I'm not explicitly saying anything. But I think that's the difference. Once I started to let people know, hey, I really do just love you as you are, and then people are free when they can exhale in your presence. I mean, that's what a gift you can give people to do that.
And that makes total sense because, I went to a Christian high school for my junior and senior years of high school, and it was a Protestant, like they didn't pick a denomination, but it was pretty much Lutheran, like the theology was. And really the prevailing attitude there was, if somebody is going on the wrong path, it's your duty to try and bring them back on the right path because their soul is in danger. So, it makes sense if you think that somebody's, afterlife, if somebody's eternal being is resting on what they do in this life and what they believe and the way that they act and, who they stick their parts in or whatever, then it makes sense that people are going to try and talk to them and try and persuade them out of it. But really on the human level, it really just pushes people away, I think. That's definitely my experience being a queer person who was involved in Christianity.
Well, and to follow up on that, I'm curious how that fits into theology, because I know I think a lot of people just think that like all Christians believe that hell exists and that's the place you're going if you're not Christian, but that's actually not like a universal thing in Christianity, because that's my initial question is like, well, like how can you justify being that way? Because by not like preaching or witnessing to these people, you're leaving their soul in danger of hell. Like, so I'm curious where you stand theologically on that.
Yeah, I think for me, once I got to the point where I said, I'm not sure if I can believe in a God whose character is primarily love and the existence of hell. I would read the Gospels and the biographies of Jesus, and Jesus would be saying to his students, I want you to forgive, and I want you to forgive over and over and over, hundreds of times if necessary, and I want you to forgive every time you're asked. And then I would see this idea of hell, which was basically God saying, at a certain point, I'm cutting you off. So I was thinking, I would ask people, well, Jesus seems to be asking me to have a higher character than God, because I'm supposed to forgive relentlessly, but God apparently reaches a saturation point. And so when I began to question just the idea of eternal damnation, well, then it didn't feel like my duty to save people from that. Then again, I started to focus more on the life of Jesus. And then my primary instinct was, how can I care for people? How can I look at their pain? How can I feed their physical needs and their emotional needs? How can I, make life a little more bearable? So the emphasis changed. So there are a lot of Christians whose primary goal they're primarily looking at the afterlife, and they're looking at heaven and hell. And then, of course, they don't really care as much what happens to people on earth because they're just worried about getting them saved. And that's what you see in a lot of conservative evangelicalism is you see people who say, they're taken care of in the afterlife. So really what we do to them now, it doesn't matter. And then you get the other Christians, the more progressive Christians who say, listen, I'm going to let this afterlife thing, I'm going to put that on the back burner because I want people right now to experience what I believe God wants them to experience. Because Jesus instructs in the prayer that a lot of people know as the Our Father or the Lord's Prayer. He says, kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So even that prayer, you're supposed to be saying, okay, I want whatever heaven looks like. I want the earth to look like that for people. And that was that restoration. And there was that, lifting of the poor and the marginalized. So that's where I began to just, exist in that place.
So this is something that you talked about in your sermon, which I'm sure Callie is going to link. Callie, link it, do it.
Done.
So you talked about, and this is something that I heard growing up in the Disciples of Christ Church, which is a fairly, I don't know if you would call it progressive. I guess it depends on the specific church that you're in, but it was a very non-theologically strict kind of church. I would hear a lot that, Jesus spent time with the lepers and the prostitutes and the tax collectors who are like the evilest people in the world, and all the undesirable people. So you should strive to be like Jesus and accept everyone. And I totally understand the intention behind that, which is trying to spread the message that, everybody deserves God's love and everyone is equal and all of that happy stuff. But then if you think about it from the perspective of one of those undesirable people, it can kind of come off as a little bit patronizing if you think about it, because people are lowering themselves to spend time with you and to treat you like an actual human, which they should have been treating you like the entire time. So I'm curious about how you walk that kind of line between reaching out to vulnerable and marginalized populations like you think that Jesus wants you to do, but then also not making it about you or not making it about God's goodness necessarily in doing that act. Or maybe you do make it about God's goodness if that's your theology.
Yeah, I think for me, what I see that the message of Jesus, or I see the example of Jesus, it's not looking at people as some sort of project or having pity on people. It's that it's realizing that everyone has this inherent value, and that some people are not seen in the culture, or some people are rendered silent or invisible. And so it's not it's simply that. It's simply saying, I want to see deeper than some people see, or I want to listen to the stories that people maybe are not listening, not because I'm doing charity for them, but because their stories are as life-giving and beautiful as anyone's. And so I think for me, I always tell people, Jesus did meet, he met with, I talk about the table gatherings of Jesus in the book and how he broke bread with a lot of people. And yes, he met with the prostitutes, but he met with priests as well, and he met with the religious elite and the people who were living on the street corners. And so he wasn't just about the poor, and he wasn't just about the marginalized. He was also about the powerful, and he was also about the wealthy and the religious, because they had as much need as the poor people did. I think that's just the thing I get from the Gospels a lot, is that here are these people who had everything, but they were still, Jesus saw that they had tremendous struggles. There's this story where Jesus is looking out at this crowd that he's speaking to, and there's all kinds of people in the crowd, and it says that he looked at them and had compassion on them because he thought that they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. And he basically just looks and says, everyone's struggling. Everyone's got this stuff. And so I try not to ever look at a marginalized group of people as a group of people. I just start to look at the individual stories that cross my path and try to pay attention to them, try to listen.
I wonder if you feel in any sort of general way that Christians have a responsibility for being the arbiters of the kind of reconciliation we're talking about. Like, we know, like, obviously progressive and LGBTQ affirming Christians are not this like tiny, insignificant, non-existent group, right? There's lots of folks like that. I mean, I think the last Pew poll said 54% of Christians in general thought that homosexuality was something that should be accepted. But if we're talking about like the religious organizations that have the real power in society, like it's pretty exclusively the like hardcore conservative ones. And I hate to make it sound like there's like a guilt by association thing happening here, like just because you both say you believe in God and the Bible, that like you as a person are automatically tied to that. Like I don't want to Right. But like, I guess what I'm asking is do you understand the sort of mistrust that comes from like LGBT folks, for example? And do you see it as the responsibility of the progressive church to sort of actively oppose those things and actively work to separate themselves from that in pursuit of this coming together?
Yeah, I think the challenge is that I am aware that my Christianity, just like, being a cis hetero man, there are certain things that are just going to be a barrier. And I think for my on the theological side or on the Christian side, I have to realize that just the idea, just the title pastor is loaded for people, and just the title Christian is loaded for people, and there's so much baggage. And so I can't fix all the damage that organized religion has done. What I can do is speak loudly into the injustices I see in the church, and that's what I try to do with the blog. And then I can also try to show people individually an expression of Christianity that doesn't look like the one that they may have experienced. So that guilt by association is real, and there's only so much you can do about it. But my job, or my primary job as a pastor and as a writer, is to speak into that using the platform that I have, and then to just try to live a life that more resembles what I believe the life of Jesus looked like. That's really all you can do. I can't, because the thing about that conservative Christian element that has been historically the most damaging, it's also the most powerful and the most organized. So you talk about, so many progressive Christians exist, and they do, but most of us don't have those kind of built-in systems, and they don't have a long history of being in the political arena, and they don't have these massive, churches. So I think progressive Christians are at a little bit of a disadvantage because they just don't have their shit together. And so once we do, it'll be a little bit better because we'll be a more unified expression of a different kind of Christianity. But you also have the pitfalls of that organization happening, right? Yeah. Because that's what the Christian right, that's its problem. Once it got to a certain size, it was beholden to itself. And so that's what you see with with Trump and with the religious right.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I kind of see it the same way I see other things when we're talking about the dynamics of power and privilege and oppression. Like, I'm white. I didn't personally invent racism, but like as a white person, I do feel like I have a responsibility to stand up against it. Like men should stand up for non-men, cis folks should stick up for trans people, et cetera, et cetera. It's like, right. Who has the power and privilege in the situation, if that makes sense?
Right. And that's for me, being especially, I have the complete privilege package. And so I have to realize, I try to realize, okay, it took me a long time and it's still kind of a learning process, but to realize that not only has everyone not experienced life the way that I have, it's also that their understanding of religion is different. Their image of God is different. Their experience of faith is different. Because I've had so few barriers that I can talk about Jesus in a way that maybe other people have never experienced that understanding of Jesus or never experienced that organized Christianity. And so, privilege is such a powerful thing because it's so deceptive and it's so, it's your self-awareness. You have to constantly try to figure out, like, okay, what do I still need to learn in this situation? What am I not seeing? And that's what, I talk about it as if it's, when you have something like spinach in your teeth and you don't even think about it and someone looks at you and a good friend will tell you, but a bad friend will just let you go through your day with that on your teeth. And I've tried to rely on good people to say, listen, this is where your privilege is, you're not seeing. This is where you're blind. And to try to listen to that. And I wasn't always, I was often resistant to that because no one wants to be told, hey, you're part of the problem. But, there's a humility. Once you can have the humility to say, I'm going to trust good people to tell me what I don't know. I mean, that's a huge part of this journey, too, as a pastor.
Yeah, that's huge. And there's an opportunity in that privilege too, I think, because when because I feel guilty. I bought the book and I read about half of it. I didn't have the time to finish it, but one of the things that I was thinking about the whole time is you're talking about expanding the table and making room for everyone. And I think that's what my ideal world looks like, right? Like folks just getting along and taking care of each other. But like the actual fact is, there are people who at best don't think I exist as a trans person, or want to actively marginalize me, or even worse, like think that I should literally be dead because of who I am.
Yeah,
So like
yeah.
I don't have the luxury of that necessarily. Like I have to exclude certain people from my life, like for my own personal safety, let alone my like emotional stability, but my actual safety. And so I think that recognizing that position that you just articulated as having the, you know, the full privilege package, like I think there's a real opportunity there, because you can gather those folks around, like the people who might be really hostile towards folks like Ari and I, regardless of what we're saying. Those folks are going to talk to you, so you actually have a power and an influence that we don't have. So I think that's a super important thing to recognize and articulate.
Yeah, and I don't know if you got to the part in the book, but I basically tell a story of being with a transgender teenager, and then the moment where outside we're talking about all these issues of inclusive church and the bigger table and all this stuff, and then outside the window of the Starbucks is a sign guy, one of those guys screaming about all this horrible stuff, and she said to me, "Well, tell me how I love that person." And I'm conscious of the fact that the idea of the bigger table, it's a beautiful idea, but that if I ask a transgender teenager and a 60-year-old guy who was raised in a Baptist church in the South, if I ask them both to come to the table, it's a much bigger ask of the teenager. And so because she has to come a lot farther, and she's much more vulnerable. And so that's something I'm always trying to figure out how to navigate that. I want those groups of people who, I do have an audience with a group of Christians who may not otherwise listen or engage in the conversation. But I don't want to invite people to the table so that they have people who have proximity to do damage to them. So that's a really delicate balance, right? And I talk about the idea that the table is not bigger because you can say anything you want there or do anything you want there. The table is bigger when everyone's inherent value is honored there. And so, but it doesn't mean you're going to be I'm not going to welcome open violence at the table. I mean,
Right.
That's not what that's for.
Wow, so much for the tolerant left.
Right.
Exactly. Yeah, I have people say, "Well, don't you? I'm a Trump supporter, and am I welcome at your table?" And I said, "Listen, the non-negotiables of the table are that you're going to have a gender-free community, and that you're going to be committed to hospitality to everyone, that you're going to welcome diversity and celebrate it, and that you're going to be totally authentic and let people be totally authentic. Those are like non-negotiables, and so you're welcome to the table. I just don't know if you're going to want to come to the table with those non-negotiables in place. So you're not going to be able to have the agenda to fix or change or save a person." And so, yeah, I always tell them I'm open, but I'm not going to tolerate, hatred and bigotry, and that does damage in real time.
So I mentioned on my Facebook page that I was going to have this conversation. We were going to have this conversation on the show, and I was just sort of soliciting thoughts from folks on the idea of reconciliation and working together and all of that sort of thing. And obviously, being part of the atheist community, we're connected with a lot of folks who have a lot of baggage, a lot of hurt, and sometimes even legitimate trauma associated with religion, because they figured out that God didn't make sense to them, so they were atheist, or they come out as trans, or they come out as gay, and that kind of stuff. And people who even if it's a loving and inclusive message that's being preached, that simply because it is Christianity or church or faith, that that's something that they can't engage with. And you spoke to this a little bit earlier, and I don't want to feel like I'm keep beating you up like answers for your faith,
Oh no, that's fine.
But I'm just curious, if you had a chance to address those folks, what would you say?
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I can tell people is that that's not the understanding I have of what it means to be Christian. And so the same way that, my background is Russian, let's say, and I'm not going to say that every person who's Russian speaks for me, and I'm going to just make sure I distinguish myself from those people. I mean, it's like any people group or any, any section, cross section of humanity. I mean, I can't take ownership of the really bad expression of faith that people have been exposed to. All I can do is try to let them know that there's a different one. I mean, it's really as simple as that. I can look at these mega pastors or these evangelists, and I can say to them, listen, they may be respected or they may be a voice of Christianity. I just don't agree with them. And I'm going to tell you why I don't. And I'm going to hope that you experience something different when you either are part of my church or you read the blog or you meet me in person. I'm going to try to be an expectation-defying Christian for people. That's all I can do.
That's fair. That's fair. I keep coming back to this thing that I saw in a sermon that you gave, where you said, "The more you try to expand the table, the more you step into the mess of humanity." And I love that quote so much, because it reminds me of the parallels between the kinds of work that you're doing and the kinds of work that we do. Because I feel like, as we try to push for a more inclusive atheist community, a more inclusive, humanist and secular community, and a more, inclusive society in general, that, those are the things that we run into. Like, I signed up to speak at a conference recently and then got embroiled in all kinds of drama that I didn't ask for. And I'm sure that you have gotten embroiled in all kinds of things like that, doing your work as a speaker and speaking at conventions and, authoring books and writing a blog and that kind of stuff. And so, like, it reminds me of the really funny things that we seem to have in common, even though, and, I want to say, even though we come from a different viewpoint, but, like, especially after this conversation, I'm not so sure that we do.
Yeah, I don't think we do. I think maybe those on the right of Christianity, or maybe the extremes of some section of the atheist community, might want to paint that picture. But I think what I find doing this for 20 years now is that there is a really strong thread of agreement with a lot of people in just being a decent, like, I was talking to someone after the election, and she said, can't people just learn how to be decent human beings? And I think it sounds so simple, but that's what we're talking about. We are in agreement in a lot of times, and I think it's members of each camp that want to keep that sort of battle posture. But when we get below some of that stuff and some of the sort of surface stuff, most of us want to really help people. Most of us want to be compassionate and want to be generous and want people to be healthier and free from trauma. So yeah, that's at some point I'm a pastor, but at some point I just want to be a decent human being, and then people see my Christianity in that, great. But if not, that's okay.
Gosh, sometimes I just have to reflect on the fact that, like, I feel like society makes things so much more complicated than they have to be. Because we've been speaking for an hour about, like, how do we create a society where people aren't awful to one another? Like, that should be a simple concept.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. I had a publisher come to me about writing a second book, and the book was, they said to me, we love the blog and we're reading it, and we know a lot of people it's resonating with a lot of people, but we don't want you to write about religion. We don't want you to write a Christian book or write about faith. Can you talk about these things in a way that doesn't talk about theology? And I said, I think so. And so that the second book is really about that. It's kind of the subtitle. The title is not quite set. I think it's going to be called Superhuman or Super You. And the idea is, but the subtitle is Becoming the Kind of Person Who Can Save the World. And the idea is, what's the best way to be human? If you and I and another group of people sit down, regardless of our theology or our politics, what is the best way to live out the time that we have here? I bet we could find a lot that we agree on. Well, let's do that. Let's do that together. And then the other stuff will be the other stuff. But that's a whole other conversation for another time. Because
right.
Again, if the other stuff is someone saying, hey, because of your orientation or your gender identity, you're less moral than me or less loved by the God I believe in, well, we have to deal with that. But again, there's a lot that we can do, and a lot of work that we can do in the world together. What I learned with students, someone told me as I was, like, learning how to be a youth pastor, she said, if you give people if you want people to feel significant, give them something significant to be part of. And so to engage people and work together, because then they kind of see, hey, this is something we can do together. I think that's a powerful tool. I think that activism, that's why that social justice piece is so important. Because if I can get someone who may be really, really homophobic, and I can get a person, engaged in work with people that they don't believe that they have any connection to or any affinity with, and then all of a sudden they're doing something productive, then they see the value in that other person's life and they see them differently. So I think a lot of that social justice is not just these projects. It's the fact that we do these we collaborate, and then we see the humanity in each other. I mean, they're just you are changed when you do important work with other people. So the more I can get people together to do life-changing stuff, that's what I want to be doing.
That's amazing. I love that. And if you ever need somebody for that kind of thing, you've got my contact info. John, this has been an awesome conversation. I sincerely appreciate your time. Why don't you tell everybody about your book real quick, where we can find out more about you, where we can get your book, and all that fun stuff?
Yeah, my name is hard to spell, but it's Pavlovitz, Pavlovitz, and you can find me on Twitter and Facebook. And the book is called The Bigger Table, and it's just about the stuff I've learned along the way, and about trying to have a expression of faith that isn't exclusionary and hateful. How radical would that be?
Right.
But really, I thank you both for your time, and it's been great just getting some time with you to chat.
Absolutely.
I've got one final question.
Oh.
In 30 seconds,
right.
prove that God exists. Go.
Oh, stop it.
Okay, I would say the mixing of chocolate and peanut butter is probably all the evidence that I need. So I'll take
See, I'm going to chalk that one up to science.
I'll have Reese's peanut butter cup, and I will just get my praise on.
I cannot think of a better way to have ended this. John, thank you again.
All right, be well. Thank you so much.
And that, my friends, is going to do it for this episode of the Gaytheist Manifesto. We are a proud member of the Trans Podcaster Visibility Initiative. We're a group of trans podcasting badasses working to bring more trans voices into podcasting and other content creation. Search for the Trans Podcaster Visibility Initiative on Facebook for more info. You can find the show on Facebook at facebook.com/The Gaytheist Manifesto. You can email us at podcast@thegaytheistmanifesto.com. I'm on Twitter at GaytheistCali. You can find the show on Twitter at The Gaytheists. And I bet Ari's got a thing.
Hey everybody, this is a character who's not Ari, because Ari definitely wrote an outro for this week. Just like they always do. They're very good, Ari, yeah. Wasn't that a really great debate, everybody? That was pretty great. I think that we smashed him. We totally owned him and pwned him. And now he's crying. He started crying as soon as he hung up the phone. But if you want to hear more cool stuff, you can friend Ari Stillman on Facebook, or email aristillman4@gmail.com, or you can listen to Sister Getting Out of Hand, and we talk a lot about social justice, and my accent totally just changed. Talk a lot about social justice on the SJW Circle Jerk, but it's not anywhere near as good as this one, so, This is a little bit like Homestar from Homestar Runner, but not quite. That's the voice I'm going
so
for.
Is.
I was raised by a cup of coffee. All aboard the gravy train.
That's what I got. Fuck yourself.
If you want to support the show and the activism we do, you can head to patreon.com/The Gaytheist Manifesto. Make a per episode donation as little as $1 per episode. And if you can't do that, you can also head over to iTunes, give us a 5-star review. That helps us move up in the rankings and get heard by more people. Before we go, I want you to know that if you're lost, you're hurting, you're scared, if you feel like no one cares and no one understands, you need to know that there's a community out here that loves you, cares for you, knows that you're capable of amazing things, and that you are worthy of love. If you're struggling, please don't be afraid to reach out. Until next time, friends, this is the Gaytheist Manifesto.